So let them send it in and let them go vote. And if their system's as good as they say it is, then obviously they won't be able to vote. If it isn't tabulated, they'll be able to vote.
The President of the United States, I want you to put your arms around this. He's actually encouraging people to break the law, to vote twice in the upcoming election. That's a felony, by the way. It gets worse. Even a 5-year-old knows it is illegal to do what he's saying, but nonetheless, he's doubled down, and the Attorney General of the United States apparently doesn't seem to mind.
I don't know what the law in the particular state says.
You can't vote twice.
Well, I don't know what the law in the particular state says and when that vote becomes final.
Is there any state that says you can vote twice?
Well, there's some, maybe that you can change your vote up to a particular time. I don't know what the law is, so I'm not going to offer.
He was saying test the system.
If you know what he's saying, why are you asking me what he's saying?
He doesn't believe in the mail-in voting. You're the Attorney General of the United States.
Why did you?
Yeah. Barr even said there's no systemic racism when it comes to the justice system, even though obviously people of color are arrested far more often than whites as a proportion of the population, and African Americans 2.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police.
I think we have to be a little careful about throwing the idea of racism around. Racism usually means, that I believe that because of your race, you're a lesser human being than me. And I think there are people in the United States that feel that way, but I don't think it is as common as people suggest. And I think we have safeguards to ensure that it doesn't really have an effect to someone's future. I think we've made a lot of progress in the past 60 years.
Barr, he also repeated what is, and I want to be clear here, a lie, as the president keeps saying that voter fraud, it is rampant, especially when it comes to mail-in balloting.
He said if you expand mail-in voting, this is the president. It's reckless.
Well, this is a sort of cheap talk to get around the fundamental problem, which is the bipartisan commission chaired by Jimmy Carter and James Baker said back in 2009 that mail-in voting is fraught with the risk of fraud and coercion.
But since then,
and until this administration,
haven't proved it.
Let me talk.
Yeah, please.
And since that time, there have been, in the newspapers, in networks, academic studies saying it is open to fraud and coercion.
Now, we discussed this yesterday during our Lie of the Day segment. Voter fraud, it is, and I'm not giving my opinion here, I'm factually telling you, voter fraud is extremely rare. With mail-in balloting also, and since Barr mentioned Jimmy Carter's commission, why don't we hear from folks who put the commission together here as they debunk what Barr just said with so much ferocity there. I'm going to read now a portion of a statement from the Carter Center. The Carter-Baker Commission, it was a bipartisan one, they found that where safeguards for ballot integrity are in place, there was little evidence of voter fraud. I urge political leaders, it goes on to say, across the country to take immediate steps to expand vote by mail and other measures that can help protect and the core of American democracy, obviously in a pandemic. And one more clip before I get to my guest. And this one, I don't think it needs any setup. It's pretty self-explanatory.
The president claimed that he heard about a plane, in his words, loaded with thugs wearing dark uniforms from a certain city that was headed to the Republican National Convention here in Washington, in his words, to do big damage. He didn't offer any specifics. He later, the next day, changed the story. The plane wasn't coming to Washington, was leaving Washington. Have you asked the FBI to investigate this?
I don't have to ask the FBI because we received numerous reports of individuals coming from Portland, Washington, Seattle, and several other cities to come into Washington for the specific purpose of causing a riot.
Were they wearing black uniforms and were they loaded, if you will?
There were many on planes. We've received multiple reports on this topic.
Again, that is our Attorney General. I want to bring in our guest to discuss all of that and more. Good friend to the program, former federal prosecutor Roland Riopelle. And Roland, obviously, I know we don't have to waste a lot of time, that you and I are simpatico, but there was a couple moments where your jaw hit the table. Not only is he the Attorney General, but unlike so many folks who are not ready for prime time, he knows better. He was an Attorney General under Bush. He's got a dignified or at least a respectable resume here. In many ways, it's even worse than when Trump says it, because William Barr knows better, and yet he's going along to get along.
Yes, I think that's the only conclusion we can draw here, Richard, is he says these things for an audience of one, and that one is Donald Trump. He's repeating the president's talking points simply to score points himself with the president. It's very sad because we're really in banana republic territory now when we have an attorney general that really is unwilling or afraid to provide any sort of guardrail to our president. And it's just one more instance of the way in which Trump has blown through the typical restraints in government.
And for me, Roland, I've tried to spend as much time as I can in the run-up to the election in 60 some odd days here, that I'm worried about what I don't believe you need a tinfoil hat anymore to be concerned about, which is come election day, people who have followed the rules will either not have their votes counted, they'll be purged from the roll somehow, some way, or the president will declare victory before all the votes are counted. But at the end, will the Department of Justice, you believe, have their finger on the scale here? Do we not only have to worry about the president, but that in some ways he may be aided and abetted by our Justice Department?
I think we do have. I think that's a very legitimate fear. I expect that what will happen is a great many of the Democrats will choose to vote by mail, and Trump is hoping that his base votes in person so that on election night, he's ahead in states that he will lose if the mail-in ballots are counted. And he will declare victory on election night, declare that the mail-in ballots are invalid, and try to steal the election in that way. I expect that's what will happen. I fear, as you do, that the Department of Justice will back him up on that, despite the lack of any evidence of fraud in connection with the mail-in ballot. And I think that the result, if the in-person vote is not clearly in favor of Biden on election night, will be an attempt to steal the election. That is why, Richard, I will vote in person on election day, even though I am a high-risk individual for COVID. And that is why I'm encouraging everyone I know who is a Democrat not to vote by mail. Show up in person and vote. Take your chance. It's worth that to save our democracy if we can.
And that's an amazing statement, but I know many people close to me, again, with underlying conditions, who are doing just that because they don't want to risk their constitutional right going out the window here. And that is as scary a testament as to where we are in 2020. But help me out, Roland.
If John Lewis could walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to preserve the right to vote, I can go to a polling place, frankly.
So this is what we don't know, and you have a much better idea than my audience and I. How does it work if we assume that somehow, some way, the courts, this is going to end up in the courts? What level of comfort should we have that even if there's mischief on the part of Barr and certainly on the part of the president, that the courts will uphold the law and make sure that all the votes are tabulated regardless of the noise that comes out of 400 Pennsylvania Avenue? Should we feel comfortable that the courts, if not immune, but will at least respect one of the most sanctified rights in this country, which is the right to vote? Will we have all the votes counted, you believe, or do you believe that that too could be perverted?
Well, Richard, we have a clear precedent for that. It's Gore versus Bush. And unfortunately, the precedent there was the federal courts abdicating any role in making sure that every vote is counted. You will recall that in the Supreme Court, the court ruled by, I think, a vote of 5-4, that tabulating votes is nothing for a court to get involved in. It's a political question. So in that case, we have a clear precedent that the courts will say that they should not get involved in it. I will recall for your viewers what I think is some of the best legal writing I've ever seen. Justice Stevens's dissent in the case of a paragraph or two in which he said, we may never know who actually won the election, but we do know who lost, and it was the federal courts. They gave up a lot of power there, and I'm not sure they could get it back now, given that precedent.
You know, we're so used to, Roland, to almost being anesthetized to the craziness, but it's going to come to a head. You just feel it in November, and we're going to see what kind of girders of democracy that are left that are willing to push back. And also, really simply, you're going to see which Republicans will put country before party if the president does what you and I both, and I believe this, what he will attempt to do to delegitimize the election. We're going to learn a lot as to how much we've lost in the last 4 years.
Yeah, I don't think anybody other than Mitt Romney is likely to come out and say that the president did wrong in stealing an election. I don't expect anybody other than Senator Romney to say that, if it happens.
And I'll remind everybody there's a so-called 60-day rule, which the Department of Justice, though informal, doesn't get involved with elections 2 months before people cast their vote, but I certainly wouldn't put it past Mr. Barr to waive that this time around. Roland, as always, never a shortage to talk about, but I always appreciate you making the time for me.
It's always good to be with you, Richard. Always good to be here.
You too. So hang in there. Now, when we come back, everybody, we're going to head to our nation's capital and tell you about some stories you may have missed, including the CDC with a possible October surprise in the form of a COVID vaccine, Homeland Security playing politics to help the campaign, and a whole lot more.